right. Hello, hello, hello. How are we doing this morning? Okay. Give me half of 1 second here. I'm in the wrong spot. Ain't technology grand. All right. Hello. Hang on. Let me move OBS Studio over here so I can see what I'm doing. There we go. And YouTube Live over here so I can see what's happening. Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? If someone could just throw in you're okay into either the chat on YouTube or into the Slido, I would be deeply appreciative. Can you hear me now? Yes, okay, perfect, love it. Okay, well, let's get going then. Sorry for moving the class online. I figured this was probably preferable to hauling everybody out in the minus 30 for today. Yeah, I mean, so this will be on the playlist. Sorry, yeah, I see the question in the YouTube chat. Will be on the playlist. It'll be there, like it should be there if you go to the, maybe I will, oh wow, a topical question and everything. Let me see if I can just show you quickly what this looks like. Give me half a sec and I will I'll jump in here to the university website. I'll quickly change my my capture and I'll just quickly kind of show you where it'll be. And yes, you can definitely watch it. Okay. Window capture. Is that gonna give me what I want? All right. Yes. So if you go here on the eClass, the recorded lecture playlist, click that, and it'll open ever so slowly because I'm overtaxing my internet. And you can see right here we've got January 12th, and it is listed as live. So we are already there. So that's where you can find all of this later. All right, let me go back to my PowerPoint. Okay. Back to my PowerPoint so I can actually see what I'm talking about. Perfect. All right. So it is posted on eClass. It is there now. All right. So does the global structure only happen between institutions at the global level, or could it happen between individuals and institutions at the global level? I mean, you can interact with global level structures, right? Like if you are interacting with, say, the global banking system or the global financial system, like I said, I think last time, when you fly off to Beijing, and you fly off to Beijing, and you stop at an ATM, and you use your bank card to get money out of your bank account in Edmonton, to then pay for things in Beijing, right? You're dealing or you use your MasterCard to pay for something in Mumbai, right? You're interacting with global level financial institutes. Now, most of the time, global level or global structures sort of more interact with each other than they do with. Sorry, I'm just kind of moving things around. They more interact with each other than you interact with them as an individual for the most part. But it is possible, right, to interact with global level structures. Just because you're such a small fish, it's not kind of typical. Okay. That's a good question, though. All right. So, I guess let's go back here. We'll talk about this really quickly, and then we'll kind of move through and just kind of do a very quick review. All right. So, we were talking last time, we were introducing the idea of sociology. What is sociology? and where does it come from, right? And we introduced this idea of the sociological imagination, right? And what is the sociological imagination? At the end of the day, really, your ability to think sociologically. What does that mean? Your ability to see, things that are happening in the world and connect them to these big structures, right? Either mostly macro structures or social structures, macro structures, microstructures, and these big global structures, right? I think I gave the example last time of, how is your life, like you're young people, right? How are your romantic lives affected by these big economic factors, like the existence of, dating apps, right? Dating apps and dating services at the kind of macro level, right? These big institutional structures within the tech industry that are trying to get you to interact with your peers in certain ways, right? And we know, for instance, that Gen Z, in terms of partnering and finding romantic partners and, finding people to have sex with, is struggling in ways that we didn't see in other generations. How is that related? If you want to use the sociological imagination, how is that related to other kind of big social structures in the world? Okay. So, we said this is the origins of the sociological imagination are in these three revolutions: the scientific revolution that encouraged empiricism, right, and scientific investigation; the democratic revolution, right, which suggested people could change the world, right? The world isn't set, right? The world isn't set, and so ultimately, at the end of the day, we're responsible for the shaping of the world, right? And there's a social contract, right? We get to choose who's in power. And then, of course, the last one, the Industrial Revolution, which caused all of the social dislocation of a society fundamentally transforming its economic system, right? And this is what Marx and Weber and a lot of the early sociological thinkers are really reacting to. Okay, we talked just a little bit about Comte. Comte, who comes up with the term sociology and thinks we should use the scientific method to study society, never really does any. And I think we ended off with, the guy with the lamb chop beard, or chops, Herbert Spencer, who, amongst other dubious distinctions, had this idea that societies evolved. Some societies are more evolved than others, in his view, and that, we should take the steps necessary to make sure our society evolves in the best way possible. Okay. So let's jump back in here. Okay, so what is the project of sociology, right? And here is a little bit of a different view. This one coming principally from, I'm going to move my face so you can see, I moved the wrong thing. There we go. Move my face to the top so that you can see this a little better. This comes principally from a guy named Christian Smith, right? So Christian Smith, he's, I would say, probably my favorite sociologist who's alive today. He's a sociologist out of University of Notre Dame. Really, really smart guy. And I think he wrote this book called The Sacred Project of American Sociology, where I think he does a really good job at kind of, giving a sense of what sociology is really about today. Right. Okay. So this is from the book, right? Page 8 of The Sacred Project of American Sociology. Says, sociology today as a collective enterprise is at heart committed to the visionary project of realizing the emancipation, equality, and moral affirmation of all human beings as autonomous, self-directing individuals who, or individual agents who should be out to live their lives as they personally desire. Right. So what is sociology, right? It's basically a project of sociologists, in our culture who want people to be free, right? They emancipated, like liberated of constraints, equal, in all sorts of ways. And that it should affirm, morally, all human beings as autonomous, self-directing individual agents who should live their lives as they personally desire. How do they do this, according to Smith? By constructing their favored identities, right? So they construct their own identities however they want, entering and exiting relationships as they choose, right? So no one should be constrained by, old-fashioned thinking in terms of relationships and what relationships you should be in, what kind of relationships you have, and you should be free to leave any relationship ultimately that you don't want to be in. And equally enjoying the gratification of experiential, material, and bodily pleasures, right? So everybody should be free to, construct their identity, enter and exit relationships, and do whatever feels good to them, right? And all of these, the italics, if you see them, they're all in the original. Okay. So, at its core stands Western liberal individualism, which and then here the brackets are mine, voluntarism, right? So basically a liberal individualism that says that everybody should be free, and it's in the tradition of Locke, Smith, and John Stuart Mill, that everybody should be free to shape their lives as they fundamentally like, free of institutional constraints as much as possible. Okay. And according to Smith, sociology fundamentally emerges out of a period that we can refer to as modernity. And how do I move forward here? Okay. So, maybe I'll say one more word about modernity, because modernity is an interesting concept. I mean, modernity in lots of ways, right, really starts with the Industrial Revolution and the transformation in kind of human ways of organizing the economy. And fundamentally, right, the features of modernity in lots of ways are quite simply, urbanization, pluralism, liberal individualism, and generally just kind of like a sense of, democracy and a sense of choice, right? Now, modernity, we tend to think of ourselves as modern and living in a modern world, but what I would say is that not everybody in the world experiences modernity in the same way. Modernity is not the same for every single person. Okay. And, different countries are more or less modern than others in this sense. Alrighty. Okay, hopefully we're doing alright. About half the class is online, so that's good. Okay, so theories. What are theories, right? So theories are going to be the core of what we talk about in this next section. Theories are basically tentative explanations of some aspect of social life that states why certain facts are related, right? Pretty straightforward. And usually sociological ideas are expressed as theories. Now we can class these in two kinds of ways, right? There are basically two forms of theories that you find in sociology pretty regularly. So the first one are called grand theories. Now through most of this next section, we're going to be mostly concerned with grand theories, right? And grand theories are, theories that explain the broad organization of the whole social world, right? Why are things the way they are? Why is society organized in the way that it is organized? What are, why are institutions organized in particular ways along broad lines, like the whole of society, right? Why is the whole of society one way or another? These are grand theories. Now again, I'll put some shoe leather on this in a second, I promise. I know that sounds very abstract, but we'll put some shoe leather on it, don't worry. Grand theories, right, if you look at grand theories in sociology, right, what you will tend to find is things like sorry, my brain is having a moment. Things like Marxism, right, or conflict theory, as we'll call it in sociology. Things like conflict theory are really at the core of most sociological kind of ways
or one kind of school of sociology in terms of ways of understanding, right? And conflict theory is meant to explain, a broad swath of the social world, right? Why is there oppression? Why are there groups that are powerful and not powerful, right? Why is society organized along the lines of capitalism, right? And what does that organization do to people? That's kind of a grand theory, right? The other one, and most sociologists kind of interact with grand theories in terms of framing their ideas, but most of them, in terms of their actual research at this point, generate what are called middle range theories. And middle range theories are basically, excuse me, theories about specific phenomena, right? So we're going to look at in a few slides in this section, and I don't want this to serve as a trigger warning, but you can take it that way if you want. Durkheim's theory of suicide, right? Because one of the things that Durkheim wanted to figure out using his sort of sociological imagination was who commits suicide in a society and why. And so what he basically did is he came up with what we would call a middle range theory, where he studied the phenomenon of suicide and came to some conclusions as to who was the most likely to take their own life in a society, and what made the people who didn't do so different from those who did. Okay, let's maybe move on from this slide, or maybe I'll go back one. No questions still? All right, we're doing good. Okay, research. Research obviously is one of the things we do as sociologists, and every academic, right, is kind of wanting to do research to better understand the world, and at least at its best, right, it's the process of systematically observing reality, to assess the validity of a theory, right, to try and or figure out something about the world, right. So typically, and this is more typical of say quantitative research, but we'll talk about that in the next unit. Sociologists formulate theories and then they conduct research to test those theories. Okay, and values, right? Ideas about what is good and bad, right and wrong, what we should care about in the world. Values, and so most sociologists I think would agree that the world is not, and research is not value free. And basically values are, they help sociologists formulate and favor certain theories over others, right? So someone who really cares about, say, the plight of women and their, oppression in society, more likely to, say, adopt a feminist or a conflict theory kind of view that focuses on this kind of way of seeing the world. Okay. All right. So, as I said, one of the, so what can sociology do, right? Why is sociology ultimately kind of valuable? Well, amongst other things, right, it can be used to elucidate certain ideas and figure out why particular things are happening in the world. Oops, sorry. I just flicked off. I hit a button and something popped up on my screen. Okay. Oops. All right. Here we go. Sorry, I got lost a little bit. Give me half a second. I ended up on the wrong screen. There it is. Okay. So what kind of things, and this is clearly a middle range theory. What kind of things can sociology illuminate, right? Again, one of the early kind of topics that was looked at by sociologists, so here specifically by Emil Durkheim, was something like suicide, right? About someone taking their own life. So prior to kind of Durkheim studying suicide, right? And he writes about it in a book called On Suicide. Suicide was looked at as an antisocial or non-social act, right? That it was something that people did because they were, as a very individualized thing, right? That they did fundamentally because of a psychological state, right? A state of mind, rather than because of where they stood in society, right? That it was a choice, a moral choice, and a choice made by the individual, and to take your own life was fundamentally antisocial, or at very least, it was something that was non-social, right? Not shaped by your social status. So what Durkheim did, right? Durkheim in the 19th century went and found a bunch of statistics on suicide, right? And he tried to figure out basically why some people take their lives, and why some people don't, right? And were there any kind of group patterns involved in understanding whether someone was more likely or less likely to harm themselves or take their own life? Okay, so what does Durkheim say, right? So yeah, he looked at the association between suicide and rates of psychological disorders for different groups, specifically religious groups were really important in Durkheim's analysis. So what did he say? Right, so he looked at the rates of suicide and rates of psychological disorders, and basically the assumption was that the more psychological disorders someone had, the less likely or the more likely they were to take their own life, right? But what he found was that the suicide rates and rates of psychological disorders didn't vary directly, right? And often appeared to vary inversely. Okay, so basically, in this case, the more psychological disorders someone had, the less likely they actually were to take their life in some cases. Now, why, right? Why was this what Durkheim found? Well, what he found and what he argued that the rates of suicide actually varied as a result of differences in the degree of social solidarity in different categories of the population, right? So, social solidarity, according to Durkheim, was the degree to which group members share beliefs and values and the intensity and frequency of their interactions. So, what did this look like in principle? A couple of things, right? So he looked specifically, and what kind of came out for Durkheim as particularly interesting in his work on suicide, was that what he found was the people in the kind of social groups, that he was in Germany that he was looking at, the people who were the least likely to commit suicide were Jewish, right? People who were Jewish. Now, this also happened to be the community that reported some of the highest levels of psychological disturbances, right? Of psychological problems and conditions. Now, this kind of makes sense, right? People who were Jewish, they were discriminated against in Germany. They were not particularly well liked in a lot of cases, kind of limited in their social interactions to people within their groups. Because, they were Jewish, so they were left out of society in other ways. But they showed a huge degree of social solidarity, right? They lived in very tight-knit communities. They shopped and purchased things from each other, from people within their communities. So they had daily and fairly meaningful interactions with other people who were in the Jewish community, right? So they were very, and they saw each other at shul, at the synagogue, at religious events, at the many religious feasts, right? When someone died in the Jewish community, the people came together to sit Shiva, right, where people came and stayed with them in their home, the whole community in a lot of cases, in kind of shifts for 7 days, after the death of a loved one, right? So they had very tight degrees of interaction, and obviously they shared beliefs and values because they're all Jewish, and they saw each other a lot, right? They had frequent and deep interactions with each other, which meant that they were more likely to see something like harming themselves in light of its effect on the community, not just on themselves as an individual. And because they were so encapsulated, they were less likely to even enter into this thinking. Now, along these lines, right, the people, down the chain, second least likely to contemplate or commit suicide were Catholics, right? Again, typically more deeply integrated at that time, right? The parish was the center of life, of kind of community life, daily mass, right? So going to church every day, potentially put people in more frequent interaction with each other. And because Catholicism is fundamentally less individualistic than, say, Protestantism, where, you have, if you're going to get your sins forgiven, you have to go see the priest, right? So you're interacting with the priest and therefore with the community on a more frequent basis. So Durkheim said, Catholics, it makes sense. They're more deeply integrated. They share values among which are, a belief that suicide is wrong. Again, in Judaism, the same. They were more likely to think about it in terms of their community and how it affected their community. For Protestants, a much more individualistic form of Christianity, they interacted with each other less. There was less interaction with the institution of their churches, right? In Protestantism, you don't have to go to the church for very much. You don't need your sins forgiven or anything like that. There isn't daily religious services, so less frequent interaction. And then the highest rates were amongst atheists and agnostics, who were the least socially integrated. Okay. Whew. Been staring at the screen for like 4 hours, and eyes are starting to get tired. Okay. So this has actually been pretty consistent, and actually I've been reading about this lately. It's really, really interesting. Suicide amongst youth, and actually amongst the whole population, has substantially increased, and what are now being referred to as deaths of despair, has substantially increased, principally as moral principles and strong social ties have eroded. Since we basically had the advent of, I guess, if you think about it, the last really deeply integrated generation who valued community life in ways that are pretty traditional are what called the silent generation. And they're born between 1926 and 1944, I believe, is the kind of age range. Since then, each generation has been considerably more and more individualistic. So the baby boomers, right, those born between 1945 and 1962, roughly speaking, more individualistic than Gen Xers, born between 63 and 80, more individualistic millennials, born between 1981 and like 1995, more individualistic, and so on, right? The Gen Zers following them, of whom most of you belong, more individualistic as well. And so what we've seen is participation in all sorts of community life, of deep social integration, of social solidarity, has generally been dropping, generation to generation. And we've seen, increasing rates of kind of self-harm, deaths of despair. So if you include suicide, drug overdose, and kind of liver failure, all kind of deaths of despair, we've seen these rising pretty steadily, in each generation, because of less social integration, right? Less social, less participation in religions, right? Each generation now is getting less and less religious, and so we see less kind of integration in these deep communities of shared values, generation to generation, which, at least in theory, though I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, plays a role in kind of increases in suicide and self-harming young people. Okay. Oh, sorry. Yes, what was the second class of theories? Grand theories and middle range theories. Yeah. Can I briefly go over grand and middle range theories one more time? Sure, I can do that. So grand theories, right, meant to explain the whole of the organization of society, right? So what is the opening line of the Communist Manifesto? All the hitherto history of mankind is the history of class struggle. I might have gotten that slightly wrong. Sorry, Carl. Right, so there Marx is proposing a grand theory, right? The whole understanding of how we can understand human societies is class struggle, right? Everything you need to know in understanding how societies are organized is all about the struggles between classes. That's a grand theory, right? It's meant to tell you everything you need to know about a society at the end of the day, about it's how it's organized. Now, a middle range theory would be something like what we just talked about. It's like, okay, if you look at a specific phenomenon, right? Something that is happening, or phenomenon, something that's happening in society, whether it's, why are Gen Zers less engaged in romantic relationships than millennials were, or Gen Xers were? And you come up with a theory. It's like, oh, it's because of smartphones, or it's because of, the prevalence of pornography. Broadly, that's the theory of a book called Cheap Sex by a guy named Mark Rigneris. You know, it's porn. It's internet porn means people need sex less, right? Okay, cool. That's a middle range theory, right? Because it's meant to explain a specific phenomenon. Durkheim's on suicide, a specific phenomenon rather than the whole of why society is organized the way it is. Okay, can I bring? Okay, I think I did that. What is the main things you need to know about suicide? The main thing you need to know about suicide is that in Durkheim's time, okay, a couple things important to know about it. Um, the assumption was prior to Durkheim that it was not a social, that suicide was an individual act, not a social one. And Durkheim showed how actually it's related in lots of ways to social solidarity. How integrated someone is in their community plays a big role in understanding, whether they're going to potentially be more vulnerable to taking their own lives. Deaths of despair, DISPAIR, deaths of despair. So deaths of despair includes suicide. People are. Oh well, that's a good question. But deaths of despair today are basically kind of a term that people are starting to use now. It wasn't one that I saw a lot in the literature a few years ago, but it's essentially meant to include different kinds of deaths other than just suicide that are probably the cause of kind of a breakdown of social solidarity, of people feeling isolated, of people feeling kind of hopeless, right? So typically it includes suicide, right? It includes drug overdoses, and I think some of the more interesting ones that I've seen, it also includes liver failure. So deaths that would have been caused by excessive alcohol use. Now, this has been more true in, say, middle-aged people, right? So people in the 45 to 55 and then 55 older range. When people get a little older and they've been drinking for a long time, you tend to get liver failure, cirrhosis of the liver, and such. So that's deaths of despair, right? And it's meant to expand, beyond just suicide to other ways that despair ultimately can take people's lives, right? So drug overdoses is the big one that people are talking about today, because with the classes of drugs that we have now, fentanyl and such, deaths of despair have become such a big problem. Could modern groups now, fan bases, clubs, nonprofit organizations, etc., be sufficient substitute for generating social solidarity? So, that's a really interesting question, and a really, really good and I think perceptive question. This has been the theory, right? Like, especially, oh my gosh, now this is going to sound ancient. Back when I was really kind of starting my graduate work, right, in 2008, things like YouTube and a lot of kind of the really vibrant internet communities, fan bases, clubs, especially were sort of springing up. There was this kind of theory that a lot of this, participation with like-minded people, but through different means, right? So not maybe in-person meetings, and different kinds of interests like fan bases, right? Being a Trekkie or being a brony or being a furry, right, would replace a lot of what religion did, right? Clubs, nonprofits, so volunteering, would it be a sufficient substitute? Maybe. And that has certainly been the theory, right? That as the role of religion in society sort of recedes, that part of that would be taken up by other people. Now, it hasn't happened. Maybe I should say it hasn't happened yet. What we've seen, say, from like millennials and Gen Z, is that as they've withdrawn from, see, you're getting me out here because I talk about this at the end of my sociology of youth class. What we've seen is as they've pulled away from, say, religion, this has not been met by a concomitant increase in other activities. It's been a sort of across the board decrease in the ways that people interact with the public sphere in general, right? So Well, nonprofits, clubs, etc., in theory, could replace. I don't know. So this is a really long answer. Could replace things like religion, right? In generating social solidarity. It hasn't happened yet. And like the principal theory that people sort of posit for this is that religion is a little bit unique in terms of its commitments. So I mean, like when Smith talks about religion in particular, he'll suggest that religion is all about accessing superhuman power, right, or superhuman powers in some way, believing that they are going to do something in the world, right? But that's a particular kind of belief that things like fan bases, clubs, they also posit a sort of general order of the world, right? That there is a god or gods or whatever, and that we are in some relation to them, and that everybody who's in that religion is basically going to share those same commitments and see them as, for the most part, important in the same ways. When you get to fan bases, clubs, nonprofit organizations, because these are all kind of just straight up human organizations, like something like fan bases or clubs, right? Interest kind of comes and goes in a way that, at least in theory for religion, it doesn't. They don't motivate people in the same ways. And so people just don't show up to them as much as they used to show up for religion. Whereas like, your eternal soul is in jeopardy. You're, or you're in relation to, the cosmic force of the universe, right? These had a particular power on people. And with the fading of those beliefs, they haven't been replaced by anything that's as compelling. Now, I'm sorry, that was a really long answer, and I've taken up like a third of the class. So I think in theory they could, they haven't yet, right? And if anything, Gen Z looks more tuned out of all of these things than any previous generation was, right? They look very much tuned out of even volunteering, working, romantic relationships, right? All of these things Gen Z is tuning out of in major ways. So, I mean, that's a depressing thing, but, it is such. So is it conclusive that religious group had less suicide because of more social interaction and not just fear about later repercussions? It's probably a both and, right? It's maybe more prudent to think of it not as an either or, but as a both and, right? That the shared values and beliefs that come with being part of religion, which lead to those greater degrees of social interaction, ultimately, probably play a role. The thing is, like Protestants, and here I'll put it this way: Protestants were no less opposed to suicide, right? Protestantism has a strong tradition as well of saying that suicide is a grave sin. Could put your immortal soul in jeopardy. It wasn't quite as definitive as, say, Roman Catholicism, but neither was Judaism. And so it doesn't seem to be a quality of just religious beliefs, because if it was, then Catholics and Protestants both wouldn't commit suicide. It seemed to be more of a function of that deep social solidarity that those groups form. Right, and especially the frequent interactions. And I mean, I'll be honest, this is held up. Like Durkheim's findings, and maybe this goes to the next question too. Durkheim's findings have really held up. There was a study done about 10 years ago where they looked at nurses, right? And they looked at, because nursing is a very stressful job, obviously, and God bless them. We need more. And thank you so much for doing what you do if you're a nurse. I would not want that job at all. So I tip my hat to the people who do. Very stressful job. And they found the same patterns, right? So basically, right, they did a study, I think it was about 10,000 American nurses, and, it was about a 10-year kind of study. It was in Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA Psychology. And one of the things it was a really, really interesting study. In, say, Catholics who attended religious services every day, or several times a week, rather, I guess it was how it was constructed, there were 0 suicides amongst that group. Second least likely were Catholics, Catholics in general, and then every group below that, right, or not below that, every group that, outside of that, again, in a lot of ways connected to social solidarity and how deeply they were tied into, especially religious communities, had more and more kind of suicide. Jews in that sample weren't a large enough part to really pull them out. I think there was only 2 Jewish nurses in the sample. A lot more Catholics. Okay, so how were Durkheim's findings welcomed in his time? I think people found them fascinating, right? They saw it as a real kind of shift in the way people thought about it, and it's why, you know, he's one of the founding fathers of sociology today. Okay, really good questions. Awesome. I love the questions. Okay, maybe I have time to just start a little bit on talking about one of the major schools, and specifically here, we can talk about Durkheim. Because, you know, this is the school essentially that's associated most with Emile Durkheim. Okay, so it's called, you know, either, I just use the shorthand functionalism. I think generally it's referred to more properly as structural functionalism. And basically, right, structural functionalism stresses that human behavior is governed by stable patterns of social relations that you would call social structures, right? Okay, so what does this mean, right? So basically, there's a bunch of social structures, right, in life, whether it's, you know, from, you know, the micro level, family, friends, schools, banks, the economy, right? All of these things are social structures. And what Durkheim sort of said is social structures can either maintain or undermine social stability, right? So either a social structure can be working properly and it maintains social stability, or it can be working improperly and it undermines social stability, right? So a social structure that is working properly, we say is functional. A social structure that isn't working properly, we would say is dysfunctional, right? So dysfunctional social structures would undermine social stability. So here, you know, might say that if the economy, right, if it somehow ends up, like if it's functional, right, then it's going to give people a lot of opportunity, chances to better their social situation, to support themselves, you know, to be happy, to do meaningful things with their lives. If it's dysfunctional, right, then it's going to lead into a situation where people struggle to support themselves. People are having a tough time finding meaning in their lives, right? People are, you know, not finding a lot of opportunity. So a functional, like, and here you can think of like, how am I doing for time? Not good. Here you can think of, say, look at the period from, say, like 1950 to 1973 in Canada and the US. You can think of that as a very functional economy, right? Wages were like wage to cost, right, of life was the highest roughly it's ever been, right? So you were making a lot of money, you were able to put a lot of money away, you were able to better your life. There were lots of good paying jobs that allowed you to, you know, have meaning in your life, you know, to provide your family with lots, you know, material opportunity, all of these things, you know, you had a lot of function. If say, or you had a lot of, you know, chances to make your lives better, and the society operated very smoothly in lots of ways during this period, right? It was a period of kind of high social solidarity, high function. If you look at, say, you know, maybe the period from 2008 till today, you could probably say from a functionalist perspective that the economy is very dysfunctional, right? That what we've had is plummeting wages, right? A cost of living that's rising much more quickly than wages, costs of things like housing and food, you know, rising in ways that are unsustainable, an economy that in a lot of senses, you know, requires people to have a lot of education, but doesn't necessarily reward that with really high wages or really meaningful jobs that they want to do, right? And this, you know, potentially, and I think we kind of see this in society today, is leading to a lot of social instability, right? An undermining of social stability where, you know, generations like Gen Z are like, what's going on? Where's our opportunity? We object. We don't like this, right? Maybe we need socialism, right? And Marxism or whatever, right? You do see this a little bit more in younger generations, right? In younger people who aren't seeing as much opportunity in a really functional economy, right? So when it's in function, you'll have a lot of social stability. I think a lot of the social instability we're seeing now is that the economy serves some and doesn't serve others, right? Okay, so Yeah, social structures are mainly based on shared values or preferences, right? So, broadly speaking, they organize society so that everybody has a common purpose, right? And if they're in dysfunction, it doesn't work as well. Now, like, think about functionalism in a lot of ways as, and I think this is maybe less true of Durkheim, but more true of other people we'll talk about who are functionalists like Talcott Parsons. Um, when they look at society, right? And they see something that's out of balance, they almost think about it as an organism, right? So like if you get sick, right? The doctor will look at you and well, hopefully not you, maybe me, and be like, oh, well, the problem is that your heart's messed up, right? So we have to fix your heart, right? Or your blood pressure's too high, so we have to fix your blood pressure to reestablish your kind of equilibrium as an organism, right? And this is the same kind of thinking that you will see, say, in functionalism. It's like if society is unstable, right? Well, maybe the problem is that we've had the breakdown of the nuclear family, right? So we need to get that, either replace the nuclear family with something else that's going to reestablish that equilibrium, or fix the equilibrium or fix the nuclear family, right? Make changes to it, right? So that we get more, stability, we get a better social equilibrium at the end of the day, right? One of the things that Durkheim was talking about when he talked about his study on suicide, one of the key terms that comes out of it is the term anomie. So ANOMIE, anomie. And one of the things, and basically what Durkheim was saying is that modern society, right, especially industrial society, led to more people that were deeply disconnected from each other, right? Suddenly they'd moved out of the medieval villages where they'd lived for their families had lived for decades, centuries, etc., into these big anonymous industrial cities. A lot of them, were disconnected from say communities altogether. And so it was those that were the most disconnected that suffered the highest levels of anomie, that were most likely to become violent or in this case to take their lives, right? And so Durkheim's solution was, we have to reestablish some kind of basis of social solidarity, right? We have to, either re-strengthen religion or replace what religion used to do. And that's how you get, people back into a kind of equilibrium. Do I think the lack of sustainability of our current economy is also why suicide rates amongst youth are also rising? I think that's a really, really complicated question. Um, I do think that probably, lack of economic opportunity plays a role. I would tend to, and sorry, again, you're getting me into something that I talk about a lot in sociology of youth, which is absolutely a class that, I would recommend taking if you have some time at some point in your degree. I think there's a lot to do with the decline of social solidarity. Especially with Gen Z, I think it's also deeply related to the technological environment that they live in, specifically the rise of social media and smartphones, which I think have generally reduced the amount of time they spend with other people, the amount of time they spend alone, and generally declined their degree of social solidarity in major ways, right? Um, Again, I don't want to. Well, maybe not again. I haven't said it. I am not like hawking for religion here, or for you to become religious. But the generations that are the most likely to take their own lives are also the ones that are the least religious, because I think they lack some of those really deep ties, and the deep ties that religion used to provide haven't been replaced by much of anything. Um, is there a strong interplay between conflict, between groups and ideologies and social solidarity? I think. Sorry, you'll have to take sociology of youth for me to fully answer this first question. I think generally what Durkheim would say is that a well-functioning society should have sort of a minimum of conflict between groups and ideologies, and that when you get a lot of conflict between groups and ideologies, that's actually a sign that you're in the realm of low social solidarity, right? That basically you are not seeing high degrees of social solidarity amongst people. I am out of time though. I see that it's 12:50. As according to cell phone standard time. So I am going to, I'll leave this question up and maybe I'll think about this a little bit more. If you don't hear from me by Sunday night, assume that class is in person on Monday. I think it's only supposed to be -24. So I think we'll be okay to be back on campus. And I would have been there today. Had to take my daughter to her school, which is like 5 minutes from the university anyway, but I just figured this would be easier for everybody if you're able to stay inside. Probably better. So yeah, I mean, if you don't hear from me by Sunday night, assume class is in person on Monday, and we will see you then.